Ayakui, Skuenakoi, Neck Now, Amy Bowers Cordalis, Nuwak Rekwoi, Numite Wa, Wak Lao, Wak Lao, Wak Lao. I am Amy Bowers Cordalis. I'm a member of the Yurok tribe, and I just introduced myself in my own language. I'm from the village of Rekwoi. I am the author of The Water Remembers. My book is a intergenerational memoir about my family's struggle to and fight to protect our way of life and our beloved Klamath River. And spoiler alert, one of the reasons I wanted to write it now and have it out in the world now is because we had a big victory. After I would say almost 170 years, since colonizers arrived in Yurok country and into the Klamath Basin, and really it's only been 170 or so years. We have been fighting, and in 2024 that fight led to the world's largest river restoration project in history, with the removal of four dams on the Klamath River and restoration projects throughout that about 20,000 acres of land. And it's remarkable what's happening. And I wanted to write the book now to honor that long legacy of my ancestors and tell the story about this historic project from an Indigenous perspective. Because we, as Indigenous peoples, really were at the forefront of that battle, and so I wanted the world to have that view and perspective out there. But also, I wanted to show humanity that when we work together on a common cause, that we can create massive ecological, social justice, environmental justice, economic type, life-changing change. And I wanted the world, especially in this moment, to know that we all have the power to do that. And it'll take time. It takes dedication, all the things, but that it's possible. The Klamath River really is a leading character, and so are the salmon, and then many of the sort of heroes from previous generations of my family. And the Klamath is a remarkable basin. The basin itself straddles Northern California and Southern Oregon. It starts at the coast at my home village of Requoy, which is on the north side of the river, and it overlooks the Pacific Ocean. It overlooks the beautiful, beautiful estuary. And then there are redwoods. We're right in the middle of the Redwood National Park. And so there's redwoods around, the ones that at least survived the logging and, the early 1900s. But there's still a few around. And it's a place, at least at the mouth of the river, where water is present in all of its various forms. You have the vast, wide Pacific Ocean, and in Europe, we actually call that salmon's home. Like that's where salmon comes from, which is interesting. And then, so you have like seawater, salt water, but then there's the estuary, which is a transition zone between salt water and freshwater. And it's like thick and wild and greatly impacted by the tides. And then there's also lots of rain, right? So rain, it's a rainforest pretty much, and so it's always raining. There's always clouds, and then there's fog and mist. And so it's this very mystical place, just even it just visually, and you feel that when you see it because it's so beautiful, and it just has this like deep saturation that supports life in a very deep way. And there's all kinds of like different birds and animals and sea creatures and river creatures. And so it's all, I mean, it's almost like a fantasy land. Especially the way that, and then you put the layer of like Yurok culture and Yurok worldview on top of that, which is so informed by myths. I was so lucky to have grown up hearing stories about my family's legacy there, about my family's stewardship of that particular area. And they were wild, wild stories. I started the book with the origin story because I wanted people to understand the Yurok worldview from the very beginning of the book, so that then they were grounded in our sense of responsibility to this place, and how, also in the creation story, the creator said all of that was made for the Yurok people, and that we would never want for anything so long as we lived in balance with the natural world and didn't take more than we needed in order to survive. And that was the language that's been passed down, that's in the book, but that was the specific language. And how interesting is that, right? Just from a storytelling perspective. But if you talk to people, like, that's the language. And so I started it with that, and then I tried to use, and I'll get to the specific stories, but I tried to use examples of how through our tenure, which we were never relocated, so we've always been in the village of Reckeway. We're still there now. Um, how we have tried to exercise those duties and responsibilities. And so there's really cool stories. I also wanted to ground people in how things were pre-colonization and when we were really living in an Aboriginal time. So one of the stories that I included in the book is my great grandma, Geneva Matz, who was born in 1904. She passed away in 1986, and I knew her, but she was raised by her grandparents. And her grandparents, Billy Brooks and Susie Brooks, were they were raised completely Yurok, like completely Yurok. So much so like one of the stories is, so it would be my fourth great grand, and then her grandparent, Billy Brooks. He was around when one of the first settlers arrived in Reckloy, and they had potatoes. They brought potatoes, and Urox had never seen potatoes. So he and his sister were one of and the way the story is told is that they were one of the brave ones that went down to the settlers camp and started interacting with them. And, there was a language barrier, but they started interacting. And I guess how the story goes is that they gave him a potato. And the language he used, his response was, "Oh God, were they good?" And that was like the first time we had a potato. But then also there's another story about later on, as Billy Brooks was an adult and he's married to Susie Brooks, and they're raising Geneva Matz, my great grandmother, and there were there were roles for men and women in Yurok Aboriginal society, but it's not like kind of how things have been in the past with patriarchy. It was more that each role was equally valued, right? And so one of the roles of women was to go and gather, and they would go down to the mouth of the river, and there's Orego sitting kind of on the north side overlooking the ocean, and there's a hill. The village of Reckeway sits right next to Oregos, and so they would walk down the trail to the mouth of the river and to the sandbar, and you have beautiful wild Pacific Ocean on one side and then the estuary on the other side. And the story goes that as well, and it would just be my great grandma and my great great grandmother were walking down the beach. My great great grandmother would sing these songs, and fish would just jump out of the the waves and land on the shore almost at her feet. And then she would pick them up and put them in her burden basket. Um, so think about how remarkable that is. Like, there were no grocery stores. There's no you don't head to Costco to get your food. Like, you are completely dependent on the natural world providing for your livelihood. And they had mastered a way of living so deeply and so in balance with the natural world that they would sing these songs, and they would go out, and the creator would provide for them. The natural world would provide for them. And I share those stories and many others because I wanted people to know that that's what life was like once here in this place. There was this beautiful harmony and this symbiotic relationship between humans and nature. And it was deeply rooted in mutual respect, right? And also discipline, and prayer, and that is not present anymore. And I think that that helps to explain the grave unbalance that we're experiencing now, and even some of the deep, like, climate anxiety and mental health issues that we're dealing with as a society. In part because we are so out of balance. We are so pulled away from that sort of natural harmony of how at least my ancestors, or at least one culture used to live. And I know there are many others that had that kind of relationship too. Um, and of course, there are other hardcore stories too of fighting. I think about the story, and one I took a lot of time to explain in the second part of the book is when there was a judge and a man who I'm not sure if he was from a company, but basically my great grandfather Billy Brooks, not my great grandfather, my so four great grandfather had sold some timber at the top part of his property, and one day, and this would have been like the 1920s, um, these two men come to the house of Leuk. Um, So it wouldn't have been, sorry, I'm messing up my times. It would have been like 1910-ish, 1913, somewhere around in that area. And anyways, essentially told them that they had sold their timber, and that meant that they were essentially like white people now, and they were implying that they had sold their rights to somehow fish, to somehow be on the land. And my great grandfather Billy Brooks had a lot to say about that, but essentially said, I have been trained about how to interact and how to fish on this land. And he went into detail, which I write about in the book, about how he was trained about you don't take more than you need, you don't ever fight over fish, you're respectful. But that training, made it so that he interacts with the natural world in a good way, and that he will always fish, and that he didn't sell anything, and he will always be an Indian person, and his family will always fish. And then he never swore. So in Yurok, we don't have swear words in our language, but he told those guys, get, as my kids say, double hockey sticks out of here. That was one of the many instances where people came to the family and said, you can no longer be on your land, you can no longer fish. And we basically said, get the double hockey sticks out of here, and we're going fishing. And that's been the theme, that's been the common element of resistance of every generation of my family. And frankly, that's how we have been able to remain on our land to this day and fishing in our waters. In Yurok, the way that we tell stories is always through sort of myth and examples, right? And also that's how we teach our young. And so, an example of that, which lends itself to this whole thing, my dad always says, you can't keep sticking your hand in the mousetrap over and over and expect a different outcome. And so, what happened is, so I grew up hearing this remarkable fight, and I write about it in great detail in the second part of the book. There's this, arrest, like 19 arrests just for fishing on our own homelands. That leads to a Supreme Court case. We reaffirm that the Yurok country is still ours. And then there's salmon wars where they tried to kick us off the river again, and we fight the federal goon squad. And then we secure 50% of the harvestable salmon allocation. And so that I'm born, and it's this time where everything's supposed to have like sort of calmed down. Like we've confirmed through federal law, reaffirmed through federal law, our rights to our reservation, to our land, to our water, and to fish, and the tribes organizing. There's a commercial fishery for the first time in, however long. And then the fish start dying. And, what good is a fishing right if there aren't any fish? It's not much good. How do you exercise and continue a fishing way of life if there are no fish? And so I sort of come about in an era where the legacy impacts of the development of the Klamath Basin through mining, logging, dams built without any fish ladders, and this massive reclamation project at the top of the basin is all catching up to the river. And essentially, by about it all kind of accumulates in 2002 when there's the largest fish kill in American history on the Yurok reservation. And I'm home working, and this is all in the book. I'm home working for our tribal fisheries that year and witnessed the whole thing. And it really was so traumatizing to me that I dedicated, my life to basically preventing that from ever happening again. And I also had I by that time my great grandma had passed, but I am 100% sure that she literally, her spirit came to me and sort of moved through me and said, you got to go fight. Like it's your turn, it's your generation's turn, go. And so anyway, so become a lawyer. I go back and work for the Yurok tribe eventually as their general counsel. Um, that was beginning of 2016. And at that point, things were awful on the river. We were down to single digit percentages of our salmon runs. The Klamath historically had the third largest salmon runs in the whole lower 48 states, and we were down to single digits. Um, the river, the water quality was awful. There were annual toxic blue-green algae blooms every summer where you couldn't get into the water. If your dogs got into the water, they would die. There were annual fish kills of baby salmon, and I ended up litigating under the Endangered Species Act because that was a violation. They would die. And so we were really fighting hard to get more water in the river. Um, but again, it was this idea of like, okay, we've sort of been in this box and kind of doing things the same way in terms of managing the Klamath River. There's water going to irrigation at the top of the basin. We've got these dams in there that are built without fish passage. They're blocking the salmon's passage. They're making water quality awful because all of that chemical runoff from the ag waters, and also just the bad conditions in the basin, um, were sort of accumulating behind the reservoirs and the dams, and then that was going down the river. And so it's just awful. Yurok, and the way under Yurok worldview, and there's another myth here. If the Klamath River and the salmon die, so too will the Yurok people, because there will be no more reason or purpose for Yurok to be here, which goes back to that original instructions in the origin story. And so we're really like facing this existential crisis. And so that's, so there were so many people who were motivated and launched into the movement during this time. But one of the things we did was in 2020, um, I redirected and worked with my co-founder Molly Myers, who's a brilliant Karuk grassroots activist, and we co-founded the Ridges to Riffles Indigenous Conservation Group. And we are a nonprofit. We provide technical and legal services to Indian tribes in the area of cultural natural resources to basically move money and power in different ways to better serve Indian country and to protect those cultural natural resources. And of course, our work thus far has been very grounded in the Klamath. And so we by 2020, things were really bad in the basin, not just from an ecologic perspective, but also the dam removal agreement was on the line. There were a lot. There was a lot of delay. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, was really at the helm of approving dam removal, was delaying. We didn't know what was going to happen, and so we reorganized. I moved my family to DC, which is, where FERC's headquarters are. Yeah, and we just launched into it. And I focused my work, before as general counsel, I was running the tribes, all their legal affairs. And so now through this new work, I could just focus exclusively on dam removal and Klamath River matters. Also, that was 2020 era. We're just at the tail end of the Trump administration. And so there's all kinds of the first administration, so there's just like this, like, bleh, right? And so, so we thought, all right, let's move this money and power around and we'll stop putting our house or our hands in the mousetrap and create something totally different, that better supports us getting at that cheese, that makes it no longer as dangerous. And that was, not the like defining thing that helped get dam removal over, but it certainly helped us be better organized. And and now we've got a great staff of mostly indigenous peoples. And we continue. I mean, we got dam removal done, and we're continuing to work on water issues and restoration projects. On the Klamath, what we needed to help the river, heal the river, was to remove dams, do restoration work, and get more water in the river for fish. And so, through some of the Endangered Species Act lawsuits that I worked on, we were able to get more water in the river for fish. Not enough, but more. So that was sort of one thing. As it came to dam removal, what ended up happening was there was a relicensing proceeding in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, to give the power company, which, by the way, at the time was owned by Warren Buffett's, subsidiary companies, so richest man in the world, um, and they wanted to relicense the dams for another 50 years, status quo. So no changes. And that would have been a death sentence for the river, for the salmon, for us as indigenous peoples. And so we fought it. We fought it hard. And Yurok, Karuk, we were one of the first to advocate for dam removal. And people thought we were nuts because a dam removal project of this size had never been done before. So they didn't think it was possible. But what ended up happening is that in the proceeding, we leveraged the tribal rights, and that, like, my great uncle's case, Matts versus Arnett, was one of the primary precedents for that. But those we leveraged the tribal rights, which essentially said these dams built without fish passage and causing the pollution of the whole river are harming the tribe's fishing rights because it's depleting the amount of fish available for harvest. Yeah. And then we coupled that with, stronger environmental laws, tribal consultation policies, even energy law itself. And what that did was we won on almost every single account because the harm to the river was so clear, and also because these dams were so dilapidated. They were built in between 1911 and 1962, and by this point, like, they were so out of compliance with current law that to upgrade them would have cost a gazillion dollars. And so what happened after we won is Pacific Core pressed pause because FERC basically said you have to install some kind of fish mitigation measures if you're going to relicense these dams. And the fish mitigation measures would have been fish ladders, which, if you get a visual of that, it actually is what you would think it is. It's like a ladder that the fish can enter from the downstream side, and it's got little steps just like a ladder, but the water's going down, but salmon are extremely strong, and so they can go up these little ladders and get around the dam that way. They wouldn't have solved all the problems. And so we said that's not enough. But in any event, pause on the FERC proceeding. We enter into some settlement negotiations. Through that process, there's an economic analysis done that proves it's actually cheaper to remove the dams than it was to install these fish mitigation measures. So all of a sudden, we had a common interest with our enemy, which was dam removal, because it was cheaper for them to remove and it was better for the river to remove. And so we leaned into that and we were able to negotiate what became a $515 million settlement agreement to remove the dams. And what's really cool is that that settlement agreement equally valued the rights of nature, indigenous peoples, and business, because it was a better deal for them. And so it's in that sense, and also it was extremely good for the climate, right? It's a nature-based solution of for the climate crisis, because you're essentially removing these dams and repairing that area around the dams so that nature heals. And in doing so, we reduced methane emissions because there was crazy amounts of methane being released from the reservoirs. We opened up 450 miles of spawning habitat. Here's the kicker. Within 3 days of removing the lowest dam, salmon came back. They blasted right past that former dam that they hadn't been able, to get past for 100 years, but they blasted right past it and went into their former spawning grounds. Um, and that kind of leads me to the title of the book, which is The Water Remembers, right? The salmon remember. We remember. All those little creatures remember what it was like to live on a healthy planet and perform these, and I guess I'll use technical language here, perform these traditional ecological functions, and work together in that balance. We all remember that. It's deep in our DNA. It's deep in our like ancestral blood. And I truly believe, especially after seeing all of this happen, that it's like the eagles, the otter, the bees, the humans, the water, the river itself is really trying to get back to that balance, that natural condition that it lived in pre-development. Um, and when we do that, from what I witnessed on the Klamath, there is this deep healing that happens, and it's the humans, like I mean, the amount of like healing of intergenerational trauma that came for me personally, just watching the dams be removed, was profound. Um, but I know that the water felt that same way and that the river feels the same way. Like you go there and there's this peace where there used to be this just hurt. And when you tap into that energy, you really, really feel it. And it's so inspiring because it makes you feel like, okay, well, if we did this on the Klamath, this same model could be replicated around the world. And we could go about healing ecosystems, which helps heal ourselves and heal the planet. Um, and we could also make money off of it. That's the thing, right? Is everybody sort of has this like dichotomy of like, oh, you can only like heal nature and not make a profit. But what we learned on the Klamath was it was profitable. People don't want to talk about that, but I think it's really important because we pumped $515 million into the economy, both locally and also nationally, globally. Like one of the world's largest construction corporations that is usually in the business of building, massive dams and bridges around the world, came and used the same engineering techniques to remove the dams as they did to build those dams, and they made money from it. So what does that tell you? It tells you that that like having a truly regenerative economy where we're rebuilding ecosystems, even just cleaning up after our mess by using, like removing dilapidated dams or dilapidated bridges, whatever it might be, you can make money off of that. And it's good for people and the planet.